It's an Archaeo-Death interview with Professor Howard Williams and his guest.
Welcome everybody to an Archaeo-Death interview with myself and my special guest, who this week is Aoife Sutton-Butler. Hello Aoife, how are you? Would you mind introducing yourself to my viewers?
Of course. Hi Howard, thanks so much for having me. I am a PhD candidate in the University of Bradford in the School of Archaeological and Forensic Sciences. So I'm in my third year of PhD. I have nose to the grindstone. Yeah, it's pretty intense, but yeah, I'm enjoying it still, which is the main thing, and getting through it.
If you can say that in year 3.
Yeah, I know. I'm still enjoying the subject. So, I haven't quite gotten to that stage yet, which is great. But my PhD project is called Pathological Bodies, Specimen Preservation, Death and Display in Britain, 18th to 19th centuries. So a big focus for me is looking at wet potted specimens from the 18th, 19th century. So how they were created, how they were acquired, their uses today, if they're still being used today in research and teaching settings. Some people think they're a bit obsolete, but I can argue about that. But and also as well, coming from an archaeological background, I did an archaeology degree in UCD, and I did a bioarchaeology master's. This is kind of very different from the realms of archaeology, which I've done before. So it's good to compare these types of remains with archaeological remains and attitudes towards them and how they're handled and display and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell and what I'm doing at the moment.
Wow, this is exciting. And I mean, you've kind of answered this already, but how did you get started? What got you into archaeology? Obviously, you're 3 degrees in now, 2 down, 1 to go. But I mean, how did it all start? Why?
Yeah, I kind of get that question a lot because I grew up in like a very rural part of Ireland. So I grew up in a very historical archaeological area. It's called the Hook Peninsula down in County Wexford. And my first job there was actually working in the oldest intact operational lighthouse in the world. Yeah,
Wow.
it was a pretty cool first job, and I worked there from the age of 14 to the age of 21. So I used to do tours in the lighthouse. So it was actually built by William Marshall, who's a very well-known crusader. And it has stood for 800 years. And I worked there when I was doing my undergraduate degree. So I think growing up in such a historical area where there's such a huge heritage sector and there's so much tourism. And then my grandparents loved history. My father was a civil engineer, so he was always working on sites. So I was always hearing about that. And I remember dragging my parents as a young teenager, like going up to see the Tutankhamun exhibit when it was in the RDS in Dublin. Yeah, it was doing like a traveling tour. And I think I just always had a love for the past. And I think growing up in Irish culture as well, kind of put me into that career path too, because we're very open about our history. We're very, we fly the flag for our heritage. And we're also very, very open about death and the dead body, which plays into a lot of my career stuff as well. So I think it was just an amalgamation of where I grew up, personal circumstances, and my culture, I guess.
Well, that's a really helpful for viewers to hear, because I think so often with each of my interviewees, I want people to give people a sense of how they got into archaeology. So that was a really fantastic story, a mixture of sort of family background, location, and culture and nationality, and just generally death, which is fantastic. Yeah. So the PhD, you say, is new area, but it's actually new for anyone. I don't know anyone who's done any archaeology based doctoral research on these kind of, what are they called, wet specimen? What's
the term? So it depends who you ask, really. So it depends which field, and I found this when I've gone to publication and that sort of thing, is that the terminology is very confusing. So some people can call them wet specimens.
Right.
Some people don't like using specimens. Some people would say fluid preserved human remains. But the most common phrase I've heard is potted specimen. So it's basically a specimen preserved in fluid. So that fluid is preservative. Historically, it would have been alcohol, spirit of wine. It could have been an oil of some sort. Then it was formaldehyde, and formaldehyde is still being used today, and also like an
Yeah.
ethanol alcohol-based stuff as well. So they can be preserved in all different types of fluids, but that is what I would call them. Potted human remains or potted specimens would be the most common phrase.
So I've seen that in various places, but it just gives me a visual image of a small little sort of potted plant with sort of one
Yeah,
of those artworks of skulls with vegetation coming out of it, sort of like
yeah,
life and death. But that's just in my mind. But no, I love the idea of potted.
yeah,
I mean, is there a tradition of calling the vessels pots? Is that what they call them? Sort of medical?
yeah,
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 so so
yeah,
that's not. It's not just a. It connects to the actual
yeah.
terminology. Yeah.
So yeah, people would say pots or they're working with pots and that sort of thing. Yeah, in the sector, in the field itself.
So one other question before we get into the PhD itself is,
Mm.
what are the main lines of has any of the research you did before fed into this, or could you just clarify that again, that you've looked at, have you osteology, funerary archaeology, or did you have any, was your earlier thesis specialized in anything that connected, or is this a clean break, so to speak?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I mean, for my undergraduate, which seems so long ago now, I looked at Mesolithic skull deposits, and I probably couldn't tell you much about that now, to be honest, because it was so long ago.
Yes.
But and then when I did my master's, it was a bioarchaeology, so it became more intense looking at human remains. But I was actually looking at DNA degradation in human hair, so that was very different to what I had done for my undergraduate. And after that, then I had a break for a while. I was working in a lab and then I did some retail work, and I became more and more interested in contemporary death. And I actually was going to train as an embalmer before the pandemic hit. I had actually started doing a little bit of assistance in a funeral home. I was doing some observation in a local mortuary and that sort of thing. And I was really hoping to start that career path. I wasn't too sure about doing a PhD. I wanted to do one, but I didn't know when that was going to be. And, I wanted to work with the dead, so to say.
Right.
And then the pandemic hit and that threw everything for a loop. And so I think working with the pots and kind of developing this subject area has come from an interest in the contemporary dead, but also having one foot in the past as well. So I think it's just a mixture of my own circumstances that it's come to this. So yeah, I was developing and coming further from skeletal remains, but still wanted to look at the past as well.
And so you may not want to talk about it too much, but this suggests you have a more than passing engagement with the recently dead, as well as more archaeological human remains, by what you say.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it can be very intense and it can be very different. And I think it almost, as an archaeologist, from my experience in my masters and stuff, it's almost like you become, I don't want to say desensitized or less humanized, but I think you can sort of distance yourself a little bit from the individual you're looking at. Just a bit. But I think when you're working with, the modern day dead or the contemporary dead, it's very hard to do that, even though you are working professionally.
Yes.
And you are keeping that distance there and you're doing the best that you can. I think it almost hits home in a lot of ways. And as an
Inevitably.
archaeologist, it was interesting to see that kind of gap bridged.
Thank you for all those preliminary questions, but of course I really want to hear about, and this is again with the proviso, I know you're in the middle of writing up, so you don't feel you have to
Yeah.
divulge all of your why results show this, but I'd love to learn more about what you've been doing in your PhD.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been looking at different attitudes towards the display, the acquisition, and the conservation of potted fluid preserved remains in particular in medical museums and in medical departments in Britain. So some of those have come from particularly dubious circumstances from the 18th and 19th century. So yeah, you're thinking about like body snatching and that sort of thing. And that was not the case in all of these specimens, which I think is sometimes a misconception. I think people think about body snatching and they think about, really inflammatory things like Burke and Hare, who were not body snatchers, they were murderers, but that's a whole
Yeah.
different story. But I think
Yes, yes.
I think people think about that when they think about these specimens. And a lot of the time they did come from legal means as well, but then there was a question about how ethically they were sourced, even though it was a legal mean, because a lot of the time these specimens came from people of like a low socioeconomic status. So I was looking at that from that perspective, looking at the ethics of acquirement, the ethics of keeping these over a long period of time. And so I've been surveying members of the public. I went to medical museums where these are on display. So I surveyed some people who had viewed them in the Surgeons Hall Museum. And then I did on-site surveying of people in the old operating theatre down in London, because they have a small collection there. And then I have surveyed students who use them as part of their contemporary clinical science teaching as well. So just to gather all those attitudes and see what people think, what kind of themes are coming out. Do people actually find them upsetting when they're on display, or do they find them interesting? And then I also interviewed professionals who work with these specimens who have worked with them in various roles over long periods of time, and to try and understand what their thoughts are on them, what issues they may have. Conservation can be difficult with these and that sort of thing. And then comparing those types of attitudes, especially the public ones, with the display of archaeological remains.
Yes, well, that's the comparative. Yes, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. So, which it can be it's very difficult as well, because obviously everybody has different personal interests and personal cultural beliefs and that sort of thing. So it's just more of an overarching look at these things. And what I have found is that people are not upset by these potted specimens, which tends to be the inflammatory thing that's said in the press, or is said,
Yes.
like in articles. And, you always see articles that say, oh, grisly museum or gruesome displays and that sort of thing. But the public don't actually seem to be that, like offended by them or upset by them.
That's interesting, right?
Yeah, which is really interesting. And yeah, it's been great. It's been delving into it, and it's been seeing how these types of specimens are being used today. I kept reading that they are obsolete today because we have modern medical cadavers. We don't need them for research. And that sort of thing. But it's simply not the case. I mean, a lot of these specimens have diseases that are eradicated, or they are coming back now because of antibiotic resistance and that sort of thing. So we have conditions from the past that, are becoming more and more relevant today. And they may be relevant in other parts of the world, but just because they aren't in Britain, it doesn't mean that these specimens, they have that interest there. We have people taking DNA from them. They can be used to talk about death and dying. They can be used to open up conversations about ethics, about the display of the body. So there's a lot
history of that. Yeah, the whole process.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to unpick with them. And I think when you have the right tools to do that, and to really demonstrate to people that, they do have, they are a unique resource. They don't look like skeletal remains, but they're historical. So, they can look like something that was created 20 years ago, but they could be 200 years old, so they're very unique in that sense as well.
And is it the case that there have been attempts to dispose of them, to the rhetoric of, you say that, there is a myth out there that they are redundant. So have collections already been discarding them or disposing of them?
Yeah. And this is something that really came out in research as well, that there is this thing where, there's a higher ups. Funding isn't always put into them, into their conservation and into keeping them. And they're sort of put on the back burner. And the thing is that they're human remains. They were a person who was once living. And I always felt from professionals that they felt it was unethical not looking after them. They're here no matter what circumstances they were obtained from. It's unethical not to care for them. in that
Absolutely.
sense. And unfortunately, I think what has happened over the years is that some institutions didn't really know what to do with them,
No.
because a lot of the time there's no paper trail with these types of specimens. And obviously, with the Alder Hay scandal and the introduction of the Human Tissue Act and that sort of thing, they have become, I don't want to say contentious, but they can be to some people, they can be, a little bit questionable. So there has been instances where they have been incinerated as medical waste and that sort of thing. And we're losing, this really big part of our past. And I don't think people realize that they do have potential and that they do have use in contemporary medical teaching settings. When I surveyed the students who use them in contemporary clinical sciences, they found them extremely useful. And it made them think about the donor who was there, and
Yeah.
it made them think about things, maybe not even just on an anatomical level, which it did. It also made them think of things on a philosophical and ethical level as well.
And I'm very interested. I mean, I haven't got pre-prepared detailed questions about this because this is your ongoing research, and I didn't want to sort of press you for precise results on things. But you tell me anything I miss out. But
Yeah, sure.
I was going to, do you want to say, but one thing I'm intrigued by is that comparative aspect of, because there's been, I think that it sounds like you're already fighting almost like myths within the disciplines, plural, or myths with rhetoric set up about these topics. And I think that's really healthy, because we always find that, don't we? That, I mean, I have certain, both on social media and in conversation at conferences, people making very clear cases about the redundancy of displaying human remains, or the utility of displaying human remains, or the ethics. And of course, it varies country to country, place to place, but types of human remains. But so, what's your take on the relationship to the broader archaeological debates about human remains display and retention?
So I think obviously it can be a case to case basis. There's issues of repatriation and where things have come from and that sort of thing. But on a whole, I am very much in favor of displaying human remains when it's done correctly, because I don't think death is something we should shy away from. I often hear reading about the death taboo, and there's some who say that the taboo of death is very is a bit of a myth, and then there's some who say that it is very much taboo. So whatever way, I do think these should be displayed, and I do think, especially in the case of these specimens, not hide them away or pretend that we don't have them.
Yeah.
Which is something that can happen quite a lot. People don't want to say that they have certain things, or they're put away and put on a shelf. And I think when you have something displayed, you automatically have to take care of it. You have to take care of it and you have to contextualize it. Whereas if you don't do that, there is a fear that that might not happen. So, I think displaying them in a contextual, a manner that has that context there. And the public are very much interested in them. I've had people say that looking at the pots helped them contemplate their own mortality. People were looking at conditions that they have themselves. People who had a kidney transplant want to go look at the kidneys. People who have heart disease in their family want to go look at the hearts and that sort of thing. So I think it's all about context. It's all about being responsible and caring for them, really.
So it's kind of, and that's I find very interesting, because I always thought that a lot of the problems surrounding the display of human remains is not the display of human remains, but how and why. And do you feel that maybe we've, as a discipline, we haven't been clear enough about what the potential educational, just saying, oh, it's for education, school kids come and gawp at it, is perhaps not really sufficient justification for having indigenous remains? But I'm talking about remains that are not indigenous but are from these isles and are displayed in these isles, or more specifically in the part of these islands where they were derived, and that have notwithstanding that some of them came from dubious origins, that have a tradition of being used, about how we use them, who's using them. I mean, I do worry that sometimes we do reduce that and don't quite clarify that. I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like you say, like sometimes it can be very open-ended and very unclear about what education actually means.
Yeah.
And I think having more active engagement with members of the public, like holding workshops, or holding events that, you know, opens up those discussions more, having all the information there and being very open about, you know, if no information is there about where they came from, then say that. Say we don't know where this has come from, but we're displaying it in this manner because, you know, so like being very open, being you know, not being guarded about things, and I think getting feedback as well is really important, and getting feedback from the public, asking them how they would like to see them used, how they view them in an educational manner as well, because I don't think we cut the public enough credit. You know, it's easy for academics to say, oh, we're going to use them for this and we're going to use them for that, but you know, you need to hear from everybody.
That sounds very true. And I wondered whether there's another angle, and I don't know if this is something you've encountered much, but obviously being on social media, I've been on the edges of various student-led pushbacks against the online sale of human remains. And I wondered whether these potted versions are also being sold, and whether there is a, you know, there is an issue there of that maybe, at least in some small regards, we need better education about what these things are and where they came from would help stop that kind of dodgy sale. I don't know. Is that something you've thought about or looked into? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it has come up a bit. I mean, they're very unusual in the sense that they served a purpose, and these human remains have became a tool in anatomy, you know, but they also became a commodity in the 18th and 19th centuries as well. I mean, the wet specimens, the pots in particular, you know, they were high commodities at auction. So they were sold as, you know, they were sold as artwork as well as human remains, and you know, so there was that bridge there, and unfortunately, that does sort of feed into you know, human remains sales today, because we have things made out of human remains. I mean, there has been, I have seen skeletons online coming from anatomy backgrounds that are being sold, you know, and there's no context there. And I would be fully against any sort of sale of human remains. But I think to understand why it's gotten like that, you have to look at some of the past examples as well, which came with, you know, the creation of these pots, and or came the creation and the, like, some of them had, like, some of these kind of remains had injected dyes in them to show, you know, vessels, blood vessels.
Yes,
There
right.
was corrosion casts, you know, that was done, and they were displayed really, really beautifully. So I think that attracted people as well, you know, the sense that they look so beautiful and they had this artwork element to them as well. And I think that's something that you can consider now as well. Like, you're looking at that from the past and why it's still being done today. And again, it's looking at this transformational aspect of the dead body, you know, and do you think of it as a person? Do you think of it as an object? Do you think of it as something once living? You know, what emotional things do we have attached to them? And that needs to be considered in the sale of these things, you know.
Yes. I wonder whether in terms of the specimens in the collections, do we have much information pinned on them about when, where, who, you know, their occupations, their age at death, or, you know, do we have that? Is that information? Is there a biography on the associated with them?
It really varies. It
Right.
really varies. And I found from my looking at these collections that, so in 1832 there was an introduction of an Anatomy Act.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, it basically meant that body snatching was becoming, you know, illegalized and that sort of thing. They were trying to have the acquisition of bodies in a more legal means. But what it meant was that people were being claimed from workhouses legally, but if they weren't claimed for within 48 hours by their family, then they could be used for dissection and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's ethically it's questionable, but obviously legally it could be done. And I found that remains that were collected post 1832 seem to have more information, and that's likely because it's coming from more legal
Right.
means. But that doesn't mean that all that information was being collected or that the anatomists knew that themselves. I mean, they were just getting human remains wherever they could,
Okay.
you know, so it does vary from case to case. And a lot of the time you will have information, especially if the person had an overlying condition over time. If they were viewing them in life, you know, and they were like caring for them and that sort of thing. And also as well, if they were criminals or, you know, well known in that sort of sphere as well, that sometimes can play into how much information they want to share. It's like a sensationalization of the criminal and, you know, that
Yeah.
sort of thing, which also feeds into socioeconomic status. But it really depends. It really depends. And to be honest, most of them know you don't have that detailed information from what I've seen.
So do you perhaps it's the wrong time to ask this question, but do you what are the bigger implications, do you think, of your thesis? You know, where does it, you know, yes, the comparative and contribution to other issues of display and conservation, but do you have any, I mean, this is a kind of mean question that I say, as when I go with my doctoral students, I'm trying to prep them for the Viva. I say, you know, they may ask what's the bigger picture, and a lot of students aren't ready for that because they're so focused on getting through the Viva and their thesis. But I feel I have to ask you, do you have any sort of sense of where this, you know, what the bigger implications of your work might be at this stage?
At this stage, I think it's really flying the flag for these remains, you know, and really pushing the narrative that they are useful and they can be useful. You just have to know how to do that. And you just have to, you know, use that context, and you have to have the tools to be able to do that. And as well as that, from my understanding, I haven't seen much detailed studies on attitudes simply towards potted specimens. You know, I haven't seen that. I've seen human remains in general. I have seen archaeological remains and things in museums and that sort of thing, but I haven't seen particularly on potted specimens. So I think from that view, then, yes, I suppose the work is pushing that forward as well. And again, just opening up these conversations that, you know, we shouldn't shy away from human remains. Obviously, we need to think about all these legal implications. We have to think about ethical considerations, but to not shy away from them and to say, look, the public are not always upset by them, from what my research says. And, you know, these have soft tissue attached and identifiable features. You know, people are really interested in seeing them. They want to understand. And I think the people see themselves within these types of specimens as well, especially, like I said, with conditions they may share. And, you know, they can see the pain and suffering element as well. So yeah, I think there's quite a few avenues that I'd love to push further as well. Like I would love to be able to use these in more hands-on workshop-based, you know, conversations, and use them with archaeologists as well. I did a class observation of a master's class. They were osteologists, and they had only worked with skeletal remains.
Right.
So then, as
this
part of
different.
so as part of their paleopathology learning, they did a session with potted specimens, and what I actually found is that they talked about pain and suffering a lot more.
I can imagine.
Yeah, they talked about pain and suffering. So they were looking at tuberculosis on the bone, and then they were coming in and looking at it on the flesh. And they were seeing organs that they wouldn't normally see. Like you don't see kidneys as an archaeologist, you know. So I think showing that they can be used in different fields as well, particularly in archaeology. You know, they can give that humanizing element as well, and they can add another layer for especially young osteologists to really fully understand that they're handling human remains. Even though they're bones, it's still a person.
May we also talk about your public engagement work? Because in the DigiDeath conference from now 3 years back, you generously gave one of the presentations there, which people, I'll put a link in the description so people can find that out. I'll have to find it. But you know, I'd love an update on what you've been doing, you know, in terms of communicating your research as you go.
So I try and blog quite a lot. I mean, because of PhD, you know, stresses and that sort of thing, it's hard to do it all the time and hard to keep a schedule that's constant. But so that's keep going. It has quite a few views, so that does its own public engagement, so to say. I've done some other, you know, like interviews I'm doing with yourself. I've, you know, done podcast interviews and that sort of thing. Yeah, so that's been really great. And like I did one podcast interview with somebody who's a taxidermist. I did another podcast interview with someone who's a historian. So it's getting into those different fields as well and talking about different types of audience, talking with different types of audiences too. And I'm very lucky to have recently, well, last year, I became a trustee of a Victorian cemetery in Bradford, Undercliff. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, which has been fantastic. And there has been like a lot of public engagement from that aspect as well. And I was really able to do that role because of my public outreach on social media and on my blog. So it was able to give me that opportunity. And with the blog as well, I find that so when there's contemporary discussions, so for instance, when the movie Blonde was released on Netflix, or when Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's dress,
Oh, yes.
yeah,
Yes.
views on the Marilyn Monroe blog just skyrocketed
Yeah.
because people were once again engaging with that subject. I did a blog post recently on Anna Nicole Smith and her post-mortem bodily integrity. And when the Netflix documentary about her was released, that skyrocketed as
Right.
well. So again, it's about trying to talk about death and dying, but also relating it to contemporary mainstream issues as well, and things that people are talking about.
But you make the point that rightly, that it's not always that you have to have rush to do a blog when
Mm,
something is happening. You can actually, I find a lot of my blog posts pick up,
hmm.
and what the heck, I didn't even know why. And then you find,
Yeah,
and sometimes it's an embarrassing misconnect of a Google search. It's nothing, my blog is nothing to do with what people are looking for, but I've suddenly got 1,000 extra hits, and it's
yeah,
because I said Bob Dylan in something, and Bob Dylan's mentioned in something else, and before you know it, or whatever it may be.
yeah.
But no, so that's really good. I think people forget just how a long-term resource blog posts can be for people to
Mm,
pick up.
yeah.
Have you, so in terms of the kind of things you've been blogging, has it been close to your PhD, or have you tried to keep a distance? It's death but not PhD.
Yeah, so initially I started the blog with the intention of doing a PhD in the topic that I'm doing in. And so at first I was kind of keeping towards it, but not really. But now as you say, it's kind of like a wider stance on death related topics.
Yeah,
And I think that's as well to give me an outlet from PhD, but also to appeal to a wider audience too. Different subject matters, but all related to death. They're going to appeal to different people and different audiences. So that
death.
was my thinking in that.
Do you see yourselves as much death studies as a interdisciplinary field, or do you just see yourself as archaeology and with other people being interested in what you do?
It's really interesting. Like if you would have asked me what I saw myself in my masters, I would have said archaeologist. And then after my masters, I was working in a lab, so I would have said, oh, scientist. And now I think it's kind of a mixture of those. So I see myself as archaeologist, but human remains researcher and
Yeah.
historian, as well as interested in death studies. So it's very interdisciplinary, and which is a blessing and a curse in some senses, because depending on who you speak to, someone could say, oh, like spread too thin in the field, in one field. But I think it's really important to be interdisciplinary, and I think it's really important to engage other audiences and exchange ideas you know
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely,
yeah,
and there's so many things, come of it, as well as opportunities and
yep,
career opportunities.
yep.
It's about conversations and dialogues and getting new perspectives. I find it very valuable. So I wanted to ask you, therefore, perhaps a tough question near the end,
Okay.
which is, stepping back from your doctoral research and the blog, but thinking about both of them. What do you feel are the strengths and weaknesses of how mortuary archaeology does its public engagement? Do you think we're getting anything right, and do you think we're perhaps not doing enough of certain things? I'd like your views, because you're doing it. You're doing all this engagement and research.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously spoken to Karina and Karina Croucher very well. And I had the privilege of working on both of her projects, the Continuum Bonds project and the Dying to Talk project, which used mortuary archaeology and historical examples of death and dying as a means to speak to the public wider about contemporary death. And I just saw how that worked so well. And amongst young people as well, with the Dying to Talk project, that was with teenagers. So I have seen how well it can work and how well people respond to using mortuary archaeology in that sense. Um, as well, I think, like you say, there can be some issues. I mean, you can't put our feelings onto the feelings of those in the past fully. You know, you can never
No.
fully understand the emotions surrounding death from a different culture in the past. You know, I mean, you can talk about it and you can say, you know, they may have felt this and they may have felt that, but there's a danger of, you know, fully putting your own perceptions onto the past, which I think,
Sentimentalizing, maybe, I don't know.
yeah, yeah, or you know, it's that sort of thing that I think about, as well as that. I think sometimes people, we see this in archaeology all the time, or you know, in the wider mainstream. Sometimes it's using the past to fit your own narrative. Sometimes, you know, and that can be dangerous. You know, you have to kind of think about that as well. And then in the context of human remains, you have to think about ethics. At the end of the day, you're using individual remains in a tool of some manner. You know, like with potted specimens, they're being used by you to do something. And maybe they didn't give consent to do that. Maybe they don't want that to be done. And I think that's something that has to somewhat be acknowledged. You know, like you're using them for public engagement and
Yes.
speaking and, you know, that sort of thing. But just say, look, these are human remains. We are using them in this manner in the most respectful way possible. And just to have that clear, I guess, when you're using
I,
them and speaking with them.
I must admit, I've encountered this type of thing on an ad hoc basis, and I've got longer term published statements on this, but I've keep countering things I hadn't thought about before as ethical that they come, you know, just come to me when I realize I'm having to confront them on social media or on, you know, news stories. And I'm thinking, why are we doing that? Why is that happening? And it's not like I've got a fixed view and I want to chide everyone for trying, because I think it's so important to have these conversations. I'm not trying to say we should shut down. I've never been an advocate of, oh, you know, don't talk about that. But I mean, one of the ones that I did a TikTok on recently, which I don't know if it hit your radar, was this Bronze Age sword from Germany that was pristine conditions. And my point was, I did criticize some mutuals and friends of mine, is that everyone was so drooling over the sword, the skeletal remains and the bodies linked to this. And this goes back to the actual press release. I don't think even the archaeologists in the press release talked about the burial content, said it's ongoing research, which is at one level fine, but all I saw was perfectly educated and ethical and good creators on social media just literally drooling over the sword. And my response was, there's an ethical question here, not for the not criticizing any individual archaeologist for going, wow, look at the sword, but about the utter neglect. And I bolstered this by doing a quick newspaper headline search and realizing that only like 3 out of 20 stories that came up on my first Google search mentioned they were from a burial in the headline. So to make the point that I don't mind that they get a lovely sword, but you know, it happened to come from a burial, you know, not, you know, what are the questions about this from a mortuary context? So there's things like that through to the people selling human remains. But in between, I just wondered what we could do more as a collective from your perspective of whether we're you know, anything we're missing out on, do you think, apart from more on flesh remains, maybe you'd say? I don't know.
I know, yeah. It's I'm like, no, we should use the pots and, you know, in tandem. But I think just really contextualizing things, getting the information there and saying the information that maybe is uncomfortable as well, you know, getting that information out there too, and having like not it all be one-sided. Like we're displaying everything to the public, get the public's perspective. Like give them the tools that allows them to be able to interact with those remains, like with the pots, you know, say what conditions are there and say why were they interested in that. Well, they could say, well, I'm interested in that because it has a condition my mother had. And you know, to really understand how they're being used, like I think contextualization and getting that feedback from the public is so important, and not just from the public, from people who work with these remains all the time, and from people who research these remains as well. I just think it can be done in a respectful manner, and it just has to be done that way, you know.
Absolutely, and that we can the more we can get past the soundbite to tell contextual dialogues with the public, as you said, through Karina's work and your work on her projects, I think is such an important thing, to not just have, you know, news body found, you know, to actually, or, you know, mummy is in a museum, shock horror, you know, or something, to actually get people thinking about the issues, whether it's
Yeah.
about disease or morbidity or whatever it may,
Yeah.
you know,
And I
funerary
think as
ritual.
well, like, speak to those who work with the contemporary dead and
Yes.
think about what issues they have encountered and how they ethically work with remains and that sort of thing. And then as an archaeologist, maybe reflect upon how you're handling remains or displaying remains and that sort of thing. So I think getting different perspectives is so, so important. And it comes back to the interdisciplinary thing as well, you know?
Yes, absolutely. So much
Yeah.
needed of dialogue between disciplines. Yes.
Yeah.
So I suppose I would wanted to ask you, pulling all this together. I mean, where can folks find out more about you and your work? And we'll put links in the description. But
Yeah.
where do they find you?
Well, my blog is pathologicalbodiesproject.com. So I try and blog on there as much as I can, but it gets intense. But yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram as well, which is Pathological Bodies Project, and I'm on Twitter as well, Aoife Sutton-Butler or @PathBodies. Yeah, so that's mainly where I post, and I try and keep up some engagement, and I try and ask questions, you know, put up things and see
Yeah.
feedback. I try to do polls with people and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Eva, and I've learned a lot, and I look forward. Obviously, you know, you're having a tough time of it, so I'm just extra grateful that you found time to talk to us. And good luck is the first thing with
Thank you.
the final stages, and you know, I wish you well with all your career opportunities that will come from this, because I think that there's obviously going to be so many routes I can see this developing, and it's very exciting. But for now, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this ArchaeoDeath video, why not check out the ArchaeoDeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.